Let's break down what wide receivers are going to absolutely dominate week 3 fantasy football. These are players you cannot afford to leave on your bench because they are going to help you absolutely crush your league mate as we move into week 3 of 2024 fantasy football. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Our week 3 pick'ems are already live, and you can claim a free Patrick Mahomes over half of a total yard pick'em if you sign up using promo code The Catch. That link is down below. On top of that, all Underdog users, new customers and returning customers, are getting a free CeeDee Lamb over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards week 3's action. You guys can pair those free pick'ems with any of the players in today's video because I think they're all going to smash their pick'em lines on Underdog in week 3. And on top of that, new customers are going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code The Catch. You're going to get those free pick'ems and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you use promo code The Catch. All right, very quickly, let's take a look at last week's calls and the players that we talked about in last week's video. We absolutely knocked last week's video out of the park. Malik Neighbors, Chris Godwin, Marvin Harrison Jr., all over 24 fantasy points. Jameson Williams, and even though he scared me, Drake London, and scared me up to the very end of that game, still ended up being a solid start. Both JMO and Drake London got you 14 or more fantasy points. The only player that let us down was Michael Pittman, who came in at just 5.1 fantasy points with a great matchup against that Packers secondary. I don't know what was going on with the Colts offensive game plan or their ability to throw the football, but Alec Pierce is apparently Michael Pittman's dad, and Michael Pittman, you are banned from the must start videos until further notice. All right, let's start the video off with one of the Monday night matchups, and that's going to be Ja'Marr Chase. Yes, we're talking about Ja'Marr Chase against the Washington Commanders. Now, usually I would leave off like obvious must start players, and for a lot of you guys, you're probably still viewing Ja'Marr Chase in that category, but trust me, we get a lot of questions, we see a lot of rosters, and we see a lot of panic, and Ja'Marr Chase is averaging under 10 fantasy points per game on the season, 12.2 points in week 1, 7.5 in week 2. So, trust me, I've already dealt with fantasy managers who are thinking about potentially not starting Ja'Marr Chase this week. Even looking at guys like Joe Burrow with other quarterbacks like Carr and Mayfield, lighting it up. I get it, guys. I do. But this is the Washington Commanders, okay? This is the worst defense in the NFL. This is the defense allowing the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position on the season. They have been getting absolutely lit up. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin in week 1 absolutely decimated them. And then Malik Neighbors and Randall Robinson last week smashed it against the secondary. This is a home game for the Bengals. They are in a tough spot starting the season at 0-2. They are in need of a victory, and they need to show their fans and just the NFL in general and opposing teams that they can still play offensive football, and they are going to do so. Joe Burrow is going to light this game up, whether T. Higgins plays or not. I don't care. Ja'Marr Chase is going to light this game up. And yes, if you own T. Higgins, it might be a little risky because we might not know, at what point in the week is he going to play or not play. If you've picked up Andre Uzavis, these guys are going to ball out. Whoever the primary wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 are going up against the Commanders, we're starting them until further notice because that's how bad the secondary is. So if you own Ja'Marr Chase, don't get cute. He is going to light up week 3 and absolutely dominate in fantasy football. All right, next up, let's talk about the Saints wide receivers. Kind of cheating here, throwing 2 guys on the screen, but they get the next worst secondary in the entire NFL, in the Philadelphia Eagles, in that same division as the Commanders, the NFC least. And I'm allowed to say that because I am a Commanders fan, but we suck. But apparently the Eagles secondary still sucks. It was awful last year, and it's been awful so far this year as well. Jaden Reed lit them up in week 1. Christian Watson scored a touchdown in that game. And then in week 2, there were some moments where it looked like they might keep it together. Darnell Mooney, that huge play for a touchdown. Drake London, the touchdown at the end of the game. This secondary just looks unprepared at all times, and I don't think it's going to get much better in week 3 on the road against this Saints offense that is lighting it up right now. Whether you own Chris Olave or Rashid Shaheed, you need to keep both of these guys in your starting lineups. I know Chris Olave's week 1 stat line, for those of you who own Olave, was worrisome, and I know the week 2 stat line was still a bit disappointing. I do think that Carr and Olave, as the season progresses, are going to get on the same page, but also the game script just hasn't really been there for the passing attack. Like, this team was playing phenomenal in week 2 against the Cowboys, and the run game was just lighting it up. Alvin Kamara had 4 touchdowns, and essentially the same thing in week 1 against the Panthers. The passing game just was not needed because Alvin Kamara, Jamal Williams, everything has been in sync here, but they've only needed to make so many plays through the air, and a lot of those have gone to Rashid Shaheed, but Olave is going to see more involvement. I do think, this is still a phenomenal matchup by all means, but this, I think, could be a little bit more of a positive game script where the Eagles' offense is at least pushing back. But either way, Shaheed, a player who we officially on the season can't be afraid of his volatility. We've just got to start him until further notice, and this is a great spot to keep starting him. He's averaged 18.6 fantasy points through the season so far, off of just 7 total receptions. Now, there is volatility here. I have owned a lot of Rashid Shaheed over the past couple years, trust me, but he's the wide receiver 5 in fantasy, and they are going to probably have to throw the football more in this game. And even if they don't, this matchup's too good. Don't overthink it. Shaheed has become a solidified flex option. For some of you guys, maybe a wide receiver 2 option with some of the disappointment at the position and or injuries. And Olave is going to be just fine. And this is a game where I think he's going to prove that he's going to be just fine. So if you own either Saints wide receivers, do not have them on your bench. They are absolute must starts in week 3. All right, next up, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. A rough start to the season for a wide receiver that held out all of training camp. We all know the story. 4.8 fantasy points in week 1, 8.3 in week 2. He's averaging 6.6. Not a good number. It's satanic number even. Brandon Aiyuk, what are we doing if we own Brandon Aiyuk? Well, a lot of you guys are freaking out, okay? And we know Debo's not going to play in this game. So for some of you guys, you're like, okay, this is good. This is more volume for Aiyuk, which is true. But I don't really care if Debo's playing or not because this is such a good matchup against the Rams secondary. This is a prime spot. More volume, no Debo. This offense needs its playmakers to step up. They're looking, at guys like Jordan Mason with C-Mac out. They're looking at Kittle to have a bigger role for the moment, Jawan Jennings. But most importantly, they're looking to Brandon Aiyuk, the wide receiver they just gave a massive contract to. They're going to get him very involved. He's still had 5 targets in each the game so far on this season. Dropped that touchdown pass in week 1. Did not play well in week 2, but also let's not underestimate, the Vikings defense has been phenomenal through the first 2 weeks. And then in week 1, Aiyuk primarily got the Sauce Gardner treatment. So this is a great opportunity against a really bad Rams secondary. I know it's a road game. And on top of that, this is a good spot for the Niners to come out with a strong performance, which they need after that week 2 performance against the Vikings, because this Rams unit is just really depleted, missing, their 2 most important offensive players in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, and they just got smacked around last week by the Cardinals. So I don't know if it's going to be that bad this week, but we can't ignore that this Rams defense has been really bad. They're not a match for this Niners offense, even with this Niners offense missing a lot of valuable players, and Brandon Aiyuk's going to be the vocal point of the passing attack in week 3. He's in line for more targets, more receptions, more receiving yards, and more opportunities to score touchdowns here in week 3. So if you own him, this is the week to keep him in your starting lineups. We can't afford to bench him. He's going to absolutely light it up in week 3. All right, he made the video last week. He's making the video again. It's Marvin Harrison Jr., currently your wide receiver 9 in fantasy football. Currently has 15.2 fantasy points per game, and he's had 5 receptions all season long. So a lot of panic with Marvin Harrison Jr. after week 1 with the 1.4 fantasy points, 3 targets, 1 reception. Something looked off there. Chemistry with Kyler looked off. Then we had the comments throughout the week, like, Kyler saying he just does what the offensive coordinator tells him, and people freaking out, like thinking about benching Marvin Harrison Jr. in week 2. And trust me, if you're watching this, I got a ton of questions about not starting Marvin Harrison Jr. in week 2. And he made the video last week, told you guys as a player that you have to start. I did at points in the week last week, I will admit, get a little bit worried, but for the most part was on Marvin Harrison Jr. and still considered him a very strong start against that Rams secondary we just talked about. And we all know the story here: 8 targets, 4 receptions, 130 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 32.5 yards per catch, and 29 fantasy points. To start the game, he was on pace for like 60 fantasy points. And obviously it cooled off, but he had a monster day, and he's going to have another monster day in week 3. You can't even start to think about benching Marvin Harrison Jr. in week 3. This is a player you drafted so early. He has to be in your starting lineup. We can't look back to week 1 and have any worry anymore. This is probably the last week he's on the video. I don't know, though, because he plays the Commanders next week. He might just be my must start of the week next week. But this week against this Lions secondary, next week against Commanders secondary, for sure. Don't, in any format, in any way, think about benching Marvin Harrison Jr. He's going to keep lighting it up. You don't even want to downgrade him to the flex. Intimidate your league mate. Move him up to the wide receiver 1 slot on your roster, because he's going to ball out again. I cannot emphasize enough how good of a week he's going to have in week 3 and in week 4 against these 2 of the worst secondaries in the league, in the Lions and the Commanders. Marvin Harrison Jr., without a doubt, a must-start wide receiver in week 3. All right, he made the video for week 1, and he made the video for week 2. Now, this might be the last time that Jameson Williams makes the video, because I think he's really just truly going to turn into a week in, week out starter for all you guys who own him. 24.4 fantasy points in week 1, 14.4 in week 2. And I was getting a lot of questions about Jameson Williams going into week 2. Encourage you guys to keep starting him. Had him the must start video, because you looked at the Rams secondary after week 1 was ranked very low, but Tampa Bay's secondary was ranked very high. And I told you guys, don't worry about this rank. I mean, Tampa Bay in week 1 gave up the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, so they were ranked number 1. Told you guys, don't worry about that. They faced the Commanders. There's no one to throw to outside of Terry McLaurin. He got shut down, and Jaden Daniels and Brian Robinson Jr. were running all over the place. It's not going to look like that in week 2 between the Lions and the Buccaneers. And Jameson Williams, 11 targets. He is just getting a massive amount of targets. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 19 targets, but 11 targets for J-Mo in week 2. 9 in week 1, very solid numbers, averaging 19.4 fantasy points per game so far on the season. He is the true wide receiver 2, pass catcher 2 on this team right now. Not Jahmyr Gibbs, not Sam Laporta. And I will say Gibbs has been very involved in the passing game. Don't get me wrong. Laporta is the one that we're kind of freaking out about, but J-Mo is the true wide receiver 2, or pass catcher 2, I should say, when we look at overall targets, and he's barely being beaten out by Amon-Ra St. Brown through the first 2 weeks. So J-Mo, another great opportunity here against this Arizona Cardinals secondary that's been bottom 10 so far on the season. This is one of those games where you look at these 2 offenses, we expect points, we expect offense in this game, we expect a good game script. This is one of the games in week 3 that I have circled. I love this game for fantasy points all around. So if you own Jameson Williams, he remains a no doubt must start. He's going to dominate week 3, just like he's done the past 2 weeks. Do not bench Jameson Williams as we approach the week. All right, last but certainly not least, we've got Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. I got a lot of questions about Zay going into week 2. He didn't make the video for last week, but he was still an obvious must start throughout the week for me. And the thing that I reminded you guys of is, Zay would have had 7 points added to his week 1 stat line if Lamar Jackson didn't miss him in the end zone at the end of that matchup against the Chiefs. Would have caught a touchdown for sure. I think we would all agree on that, right? It's wide open, but nonetheless, he still had 11.1 fantasy points in week 1 and then really showed up in week 2 with 22.1 fantasy points because he did have a touchdown. He's had at least 10 targets in each game so far on the season. This Ravens offense, specifically the passing attack, is just funneling through Zay Flowers. And that was my whole argument of absolutely do not bench Zay Flowers in week 2, because we look at the pass catchers on this team, it's Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, and Justice Hill. Like Rashad Bateman, Devontae Walker, Nelson Aguilar, these guys are not doing anything. They are not putting any fear into opposing defenses whatsoever. And their target volume has been extremely low compared to Zay Flowers. He's going to continue to be the heartbeat of this Ravens offense through the air. The volume's there. The yards per catch have been there. Now has a touchdown on the season. He should have had a touchdown in week 1. Everything's there for Zay Flowers to just be a true wide receiver 1. I like this matchup against the Cowboys. It's not the best on paper. It's not the worst on paper either, but I will tell you, I just don't trust this Dallas Cowboys defense on a week in, week out basis right now. And they do have good corners on this defense. And, Diggs is probably going to be on Zay Flowers, but I'm just not worried about it. I think this is going to be a good offensive day, probably for both teams, the way the Ravens defense is playing right now. But Zay Flowers is going to shine once again in week 3 in a good game script. If you own him, there is no reason to even start to think about Zay Flowers. At this point, he's going to be a week in, week out, absolute no-brainer, must-start wide receiver, and he is set to dominate week 3 fantasy football. That'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, guys, we have everything that you need for week 3 fantasy football live on the channel. Start sits at running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends for every matchup, every single relevant player. I'll have those links down below. We have must-start defenses, must-start kickers, or early waiver wire video out. We also have a running back video for running backs that will dominate week 3. We'll have a buy low video coming out at the end of the week and a last minute waiver wire video coming out Saturday, as well as an everything that you need to know video Sunday morning before week 3 Sunday slate kicks off, as well as fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any content, and we can help you guys do whatever we can to help you bring home a dub week in and week out throughout the entire season. Most importantly, make sure you guys drop your fantasy questions down below in the comment section. I will answer every single comment on this video before Sunday's slate kicks off. So make sure you guys drop your fantasy football questions down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.